You respond when people need you. You forgive when someone fails. You try to understand other people's bad moods. You give a second chance, sometimes a third. You find words to lift up the people you love when they are down. But the moment you make a mistake, all that mercy disappears. With others, you say, you're going through a difficult season. With yourself, I should be better than this. With others, everyone makes mistakes. With yourself, I ruin everything. And maybe you've become so used to living this way that you no longer even notice the contradiction. You offer others a humanity that you refuse to allow yourself. That's why rejection hurts so much. That's why criticism stays in your head for hours. That's why you look at people who seem to be further ahead and feel that something is wrong with your life. It's not just because you want to improve. It's because, at some point, improvement stopped being growth and became an attempt to finally feel worthy. And until that changes, no amount of approval will ever be enough. Today, we're going to explore 6 stoic and biblical principles for learning to love yourself without selfishness, without arrogance, and without turning self-love into an excuse to stay the same. And I want to leave you with a question right from the start. How many times have you abandoned what you knew was right because you didn't want to risk being abandoned by someone? Maybe that answer reveals much more about your relationship with yourself than any mirror ever could. Because loving yourself, in the way we're going to talk about here, does not mean putting yourself at the center of the universe. It means stopping the destruction of the person God placed under your responsibility, you. And the first thing we need to understand is this. If your worth depends on people's reactions, your peace will always be in their hands. A message that gets seen but not answered changes your mood. When criticism makes you question something you believed in just 5 minutes ago, someone pulls away and immediately your mind launches an investigation. What did I do? What was I lacking? Why wasn't I enough? Notice the danger. You're not just listening to someone else's opinion. You're giving that person the authority to define who you are. Epictetus built much of his philosophy around an extremely simple distinction. Some things depend on us. Others do not. Your character can be developed, your choices can be examined, your reaction can be disciplined, your honesty, your courage, and your conduct are your responsibility. But you cannot control who will like you. You cannot control who will stay. You cannot control who will recognize your intentions. And you cannot control how someone will interpret a decision you make. So there is a painful contradiction in building your worth precisely on what you cannot govern. But the Christian faith adds something decisive to this understanding. If Stoicism teaches us to remove our peace from the unstable judgment of people, faith shows us where our identity can be anchored. In Galatians 1:10, Paul asks a question that cuts directly through this conflict. If he were still trying to please people, he would not be living as a servant of Christ. This is not permission to disregard people's opinions. It is a correction of authority. You can listen to criticism without turning it into your identity. You can receive advice without living as a slave to approval. You can acknowledge a mistake without concluding that you've lost your worth. And you can be rejected without turning human rejection into a spiritual sentence. Jesus summarizes something even deeper in Matthew 22:39. Love your neighbor as yourself. Notice that the commandment does not present love for your neighbor and care for yourself as enemies. A healthy measure is already assumed there. The problem begins when you call something love, even though it requires your own destruction. You tolerate disrespect to appear understanding. You silence a conviction so you can keep belonging. You say yes, while something inside you knows you should say no. You change your personality depending on who is in the room. And then you get home emotionally exhausted without understanding why. But there was something you may not have realized yet. Every time you have to abandon your principles to gain approval, the price of acceptance is yourself. Marcus Aurelius faced praise, criticism, intrigue, and the expectations of people throughout the empire. Yet in his reflections, he repeatedly returned to what he could truly govern, his own judgment and his own conduct. That discipline is still necessary today, except now the empire fits inside your pocket. Comments, likes, messages, comparisons, people displaying carefully curated lives while you compare what they show with what you know is most fragile within yourself. And your mind begins to ask, am I falling behind? Am I interesting enough? Will anyone choose me? Should my life be different? The more these questions determine your worth, the more vulnerable you become to the next look, the next silence, the next rejection. So, starting today, try making one small change. When someone disapproves of you, don't immediately rush to defend yourself or condemn yourself. Ask 3 questions. Did I act with integrity? Is there any truth in this criticism that could make me better? Am I trying to correct my character? Or am I just trying to regain this person's approval? This is Stoicism applied, separating what depends on you from what belongs to someone else. And it is also spiritual maturity, placing your conscience before God before placing it before the crowd. If you were wrong, correct it. If you need to ask for forgiveness, ask. If there is something in your character that needs to change, have the courage to change it. Loving yourself does not mean protecting your ego from the truth. It means not turning the truth into a weapon against your own identity, because God does not need you to hate yourself in order to transform you. And maybe this is the beginning of the freedom you're looking for. You don't have to choose between accepting who you are and growing. You can do both. You can recognize your dignity today and still discipline what needs to change tomorrow. You can stop begging people to confirm your worth and start building a life that is consistent with your principles and with God. Because when that happens, rejection may still hurt. Criticism may still bother you. Absence may still make you sad. But none of them has the right to tell you who you are anymore. And this change prepares the way for the second thing, because there is another silent way of abandoning yourself, not through other people, but through the way you continue punishing who you were in the past. The second thing is learning to stop turning your mistakes into a sentence against yourself, because some people have already left the situation that hurt them, but they continue living inside it emotionally. You remember the decision you shouldn't have made, the opportunity you missed, the person you hurt, the relationship you allowed to go too far, the money you wasted, the years when you knew you needed to change but kept putting it off. And there is an especially cruel sentence that appears when you look back. I should have known better, but should you really have? You're judging who you were back then, using the awareness you only gained after going through it. Today you see signs you couldn't see before. Today you recognize patterns that once seemed normal. Today you understand consequences that, back then, you had not yet experienced. And then you use the wisdom you acquired after the fall to humiliate the person who did not yet possess that wisdom before it. This is where Stoicism makes a fundamental distinction. You no longer control what happened, but you still have a part in what you will do with it. Epictetus taught that it is not only events that disturb human beings, but the judgments we form about them. Your mistake belongs to the past. The conclusion that this mistake proves you are unworthy continues to be produced in the present, and that changes everything, because responsibility and condemnation are not the same thing. Responsibility says, I did this. I need to acknowledge it, repair what can be repaired, and learn. Condemnation says, I did this, therefore this is who I am. One corrects behavior, the other imprisons identity, and the Christian faith does not eliminate responsibility. It prevents responsibility from being transformed into permanent condemnation. Peter may be one of the most human examples of this. He did not fail quietly. After declaring that he would remain with Jesus, even in the face of danger, Peter denied him 3 times. Imagine the weight of that memory. He had heard Christ's teachings. He had walked beside him. He had declared his loyalty. And when the moment of pressure came, he was afraid. The story could have ended there, with a man defined by the worst moment of his life, but it doesn't. After the resurrection in John 21, Jesus meets Peter again. And notice what does not happen. Jesus does not pretend the fall never happened, nor does he reduce Peter to that fall. He confronts him through a repeated question about love, and then gives him responsibility again. Feed my sheep. Peter needed to face what had happened, but he was not called to live there. This brief episode helps us understand a distinction many people have lost. Grace is not pretending that nothing happened. Grace is refusing to allow what happened to have the final word over what you can still become. And here, Stoicism and faith come close without becoming the same thing. Marcus Aurelius constantly recorded his own failures and the need to return to character, reason, and duty. He did not need to declare that he would never lose his patience again. He needed to return whenever he realized he had moved away from what he considered virtuous. Stoicism teaches us to return to what we can govern now. The Christian faith adds the possibility of repentance, forgiveness, and restoration before God. One says, do not waste the present trying to control what has already happened. The other says, if there has been repentance, you do not need to keep living as though God's grace stopped exactly where you fell. Romans 8:1 declares that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. That does not mean choices have no consequences. Peter continued knowing that he had denied Jesus. Some decisions leave scars. Some opportunities truly do not return. Some relationships cannot be rebuilt. Some words cannot be taken back once they have been spoken. But there is an enormous difference between carrying a scar and continuing to reopen the wound. Think of someone who spent years trying to be accepted in a relationship. Let's call him Daniel. Daniel noticed little things from the beginning. He accepted comments that belittled him. He apologized for legitimate needs. He constantly changed plans to avoid conflict. When friends warned him, he defended the relationship. Not because he was incapable of seeing everything, but because he was afraid of losing what he believed was his only chance to be loved. Years later, the relationship ended, and then something curious happened. Daniel finally left the relationship, but the relationship did not leave him. Now he wasn't suffering only because of what the other person had done. He was suffering because of what he himself had allowed. How could I have accepted that? Why didn't I leave sooner? How many years did I lose? How could I have been so weak? On the outside, it looked like Daniel was reflecting. On the inside, he was simply learning a new way to keep hurting himself. But there was something he still had not realized. Every night, he judged the man he had been 5 years earlier, using the strength that man had only developed after 5 years of pain. And that was when his perspective began to change. Instead of asking, why was I so weak, he began to ask, what didn't I understand about myself that made me accept that? The answer did not absolve him of responsibility, it gave him direction. He realized he didn't just need to forget that person. He needed to understand why he had associated love with tolerating abandonment, silence, and disrespect. Then the story stopped being only about someone who had hurt him. It began to reveal what needed to be transformed within him. That is the proper place for pain, not on the throne, in the classroom. And here is the moment of revelation. Maybe your greatest mistake is not what happened years ago. Maybe it is continuing to give away new years to pay an emotional debt that suffering will never be able to settle. You can spend 10 years hating who you were. It will not bring back a single minute. But it can steal 10 years from who you could still become. So when a painful memory returns, try 3 movements. First, separate the fact from the identity. I failed is not the same as I am a failure. I was immature does not mean I am incapable of maturing. Second, look for concrete responsibility. Is there someone you need to ask for forgiveness? Is there something you can still repair? Is there a behavior you need to abandon? Then do what is still under your responsibility. Third, after extracting the lesson, return to the present, because true repentance produces change. Self-punishment produces mental repetition, and you will know the difference by the fruit. If remembering the past is making you more responsible, humble, wise, and aware, growth is happening. But if the memory only repeats, you're worthless, you lost everything, you'll never change, then you're no longer learning from the past. You are allowing it to continue governing you. And this leads us to the third thing, because there is a reason so many people can forgive others, but fall into despair when they are alone with themselves. When the noise disappears, they finally hear the voice they have been living with every day. The third thing is learning to remain with yourself without needing to run away from yourself. Notice how often silence lasts only a few seconds. You step into the elevator, you grab your phone. You wait for something, you grab your phone. You sit down to eat alone. You look for something to watch. You lie down to sleep. You scroll until sleep takes over. And maybe it seems like nothing more than a modern habit, but sometimes something deeper is happening. Because when the noise dies down, certain questions begin to appear. Why does that still hurt me? Why do I need that person to reach out to me so badly? Why am I living in a way that gives me no peace? Why do I keep saying I'm fine when I know I'm not? Then the noise comes back, and the question disappears, temporarily. The Stoics understood that a mind incapable of remaining with itself becomes extremely dependent on what happens outside of it. Marcus Aurelius wrote his reflections not to impress an audience, but to examine his own mind. He turned inward to correct judgments, remember principles, and put his thoughts back in order. But here we need to make an important distinction. For the Christian faith, turning inward does not mean finding all the answers within ourselves. It means creating enough silence to recognize what is governing our heart and bring it before God. Psalm 139 contains a profoundly uncomfortable prayer. Search me, O God, and know my heart. See if there is any wicked way in me. This is not running away from yourself. It is the courage to be examined. Stoicism teaches us to observe our judgments. Faith teaches us to place those judgments before God as well. And when these two disciplines are applied correctly, solitude stops being abandonment. It becomes a space for clarity. You begin to realize that maybe you don't miss that person. Maybe you miss the validation you received from them. Maybe you're not really afraid of being alone. Maybe you're afraid of the thoughts that appear when no one is around to distract you. So learning to be with yourself does not mean isolating yourself. It means not needing constant distraction just to tolerate your own presence. And that brings us to the fourth thing. Stop abandoning yourself to keep other people from abandoning you. This abandonment rarely happens all at once. It happens through small concessions. You laugh at something that hurt you so you won't seem sensitive. You accept something that violates a boundary because you don't want to create conflict. You say it's fine when there is, in fact, a problem. You're always available because you fear that the day you say no, you will stop being important. And slowly you teach people how to treat you. But you also teach yourself something. To keep being loved, I have to make myself smaller. This is where the Stoic concept of virtue becomes indispensable. For the Stoics, a decision does not become right simply because it produces approval. The question is whether it is consistent with reason, justice, courage, and self-control. The Christian faith adds another measure. Proverbs 4:23 instructs, above all else, guard your heart. Guarding does not mean hardening. And having boundaries does not mean having no love. Jesus loved deeply and yet did not surrender himself indiscriminately to everyone's expectations. There were times to serve, times to withdraw, times to answer, and times not to answer. Therefore, there is a difference between loving someone and giving that person unrestricted authority over your peace. You can forgive and keep your distance. You can love and say no. You can be generous without allowing yourself to be exploited. You can understand someone's pain without turning their pain into permission to keep hurting you. This is not putting yourself above others. It is stopping the belief that loving your neighbor requires putting yourself beneath everyone. And maybe one of the clearest tests is this: who do you have to become for that person to keep liking you? If you have to lie about what you feel, abandon your convictions, tolerate humiliation, repeatedly accept what destroys your peace, maybe you're not preserving a relationship, maybe you're preserving a prison. But there is an essential caution here. Not every discomfort means a boundary has been violated. Sometimes someone is simply telling you a truth you did not want to hear. That is why Stoicism and faith are so important together. Stoicism keeps you from turning emotion into absolute authority. Faith keeps you from turning your own ego into absolute authority. You examine, you pray, you observe the fruit. You ask whether there is truth in the criticism, and then you act with courage, not merely on impulse, because a healthy boundary is not born from revenge, it is born from clarity. Now we come to the fifth thing. Keep the small promises you make to yourself. Many people try to build self-esteem through words. The Stoics built character through practice. You can repeat 100 times, "I am disciplined." But if you abandon every decision as soon as it becomes uncomfortable, your own mind begins to stop believing you. You promise that tomorrow you'll get up on time. You put it off. You say you're not going to look for that person anymore. You do. You decide you're going to take care of your health. You give up when the motivation fades. You say you're going to set aside time for God. Then you give the first hour of your morning to your phone. None of these small decisions seems capable of destroying a life, but repeated over and over, they produce something dangerous. You stop trusting your own word. Epictetus insisted that philosophy should not exist only in speech, but in the way we live. And James 1:22 presents a similar demand in the spiritual life: be doers of the word, and not hearers only. See again how the two paths converge in practice. It is not enough to admire discipline. Practice it. It is not enough to agree with a principle. Live it. It is not enough to pray for transformation while continuing to protect the very habit that needs to die. Faith does not eliminate responsibility. It gives purpose to responsibility. And discipline without purpose can easily become pride, obsession, or mere performance. So you don't need to begin by promising to transform your entire life. Choose one small promise. Maybe tomorrow you spend the first 15 minutes of your day without touching your phone. Maybe you keep the time you set for your walk. Maybe you stop visiting the profile of someone you know you need to let go. Maybe you set aside 10 minutes for prayer and reflection before beginning your responsibilities. Now keep it. Don't post about it. Don't announce it. Don't wait for praise. Just keep it. Then do it again. Because every time your action confirms your word, you deposit a small piece of evidence within yourself. I can trust myself to do what I recognize as right. And here we find one of the most mature forms of self-love. Not the kind that says, I deserve to do anything that makes me feel good, but the kind that says, I respect myself too much to keep handing my future over to every impulse of the present. Paul uses a similar image in 1 Corinthians 9 when he speaks of discipline like someone who runs with purpose and exercises self-control, not to earn worth before God, but because a life guided by purpose requires direction. Stoicism calls you to mastery over your choices. Faith reminds you whom those choices should serve. And that is precisely what prepares us for the sixth and final thing. Because maybe you're willing to discipline your habits, establish boundaries, and correct your mistakes. But there is still a hidden condition within you. When I finally become that person, then I will be able to be at peace with myself. And that condition can keep you running for an entire lifetime without ever allowing you to arrive. The sixth thing is to stop postponing your acceptance until you become someone who does not yet exist, because there is a silent form of rejection that looks like ambition. When I lose weight, I'll feel good about myself. When I make more money, I'll respect myself. When I find someone, I'll feel complete. When I finally become disciplined, I'll be proud of myself. When I get through all of this, then I'll have peace. Notice what happens. Your entire life begins to be divided between two people, who you are today and who you believe you need to become in order to finally deserve what you're looking for. And the person you are today always loses. Maybe you're building a better future. That's good. The problem begins when you turn that future into a condition for allowing the person who exists now to be treated with dignity. Seneca repeatedly warned against a life governed by external conditions, wealth, position, recognition, favorable circumstances, because there will always be something still missing. And Marcus Aurelius reminded himself to return to the present and do well what the moment required. Stoicism never needed perfection in order to begin practicing virtue. You practice now, with your current limitations, with what you still need to learn, with what you still haven't resolved. But the Christian faith adds an even deeper dimension. Ephesians 2:10 says that we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works. Notice the order. You do not need to perform enough good works to finally become someone God can use. There is an identity that is received, and from that identity there is a path to be lived. This completely changes the logic of transformation. You don't take care of yourself because you hate yourself. You take care of yourself because there is value in what you have received. You don't discipline your mind because you're ashamed of who you are. You discipline it because you don't want to waste what you can still become. You don't seek a better life to prove that you deserve to exist. You seek a better life because you understand that you have been given responsibility for the life you have. Acceptance is not complacency. That distinction needs to be very clear. Accepting that you are here does not mean deciding to stay here. You can look at your financial situation and say, this needs to change. You can look at your health and admit, I have neglected my body. You can recognize, my need for approval is destroying my relationships. You can realize, I am distant from God. You can admit, I have been undisciplined. But none of those realizations requires, therefore, I need to hate myself. In fact, self-hatred often makes change more difficult. When every failure becomes an attack on your identity, you begin to avoid anything that exposes your limitations. It's easier to run away, procrastinate, distract yourself, give up, because trying again means risking confirmation of what you already fear believing about yourself. That is why sustainable transformation needs truth and grace. Truth says, this needs to change. Grace answers, then let's begin. And this is where everything we've seen needs to leave reflection and enter your life. Not tomorrow, today. First action, audit what governs your sense of worth. Take a sheet of paper and write, what needs to happen for me to feel like I'm enough? Don't answer quickly. Maybe it's, I need that person to come back. I need to make a certain amount of money. I need to be admired. I need to prove that they were wrong about me. I need to have a certain body. Then ask, how much of this is actually under my control? This is the Stoic part. You are separating responsibility from dependence. Now ask another question. Have I been seeking my identity in something that could disappear tomorrow? This is the spiritual part. Because whatever occupies the center of your identity inevitably gains enormous power over your peace. Second action, make one small promise and keep it for 7 days. Don't try to rebuild your entire life on a Monday. Choose one thing. 10 minutes of prayer in the morning, a daily walk. 30 minutes without your phone after waking up. Stop looking for someone you've decided to leave in the past. Go to sleep at the time you set. Choose something simple, specific, and possible. Why does this work? Because you begin replacing intention with evidence. Marcus Aurelius did not build character merely by thinking about virtue. Epictetus did not treat philosophy as intellectual decoration. Principles had to reach conduct. And James reminds us that hearing without practicing is not enough. So for 7 days, do one thing that confirms, my word to myself has value too. If you fail one day, don't turn one stumble into your identity. Return the next day. Discipline does not mean never falling. It means not using the fall as permission to abandon the path. Third action, practice one boundary without guilt. Think of a situation in which you frequently abandon your peace to preserve someone's approval. Maybe you need to say, I can't today. Maybe you need to stop over-explaining a decision. Maybe you need to end a conversation when disrespect begins. Maybe the boundary is simply not answering immediately. But before you act, examine your motivation. Is the boundary coming from clarity or revenge? Does it protect what is healthy, or does it merely avoid a necessary conversation? Is it aligned with justice, courage, and self-control? Can you present this decision before God with a clear conscience? Then act, without cruelty, without spectacle, without needing to punish anyone. Because a healthy boundary does not say, you don't matter. It says, I can't keep acting as though I don't matter either. Now stop for a few seconds and think about the person you have been toward yourself. If another person spoke to you every day the way you speak to yourself, would you want to stay close to them? If someone broke as many promises as you break to yourself, would you trust them? If someone demanded that you be perfect before offering you respect, would you call that love? Then why normalize that relationship within yourself? And here is the challenge of this video. For the next 7 days, don't try to love yourself more. Do something more concrete. Stop abandoning yourself. When you make a mistake, correct it without destroying yourself. When you need to say no, don't say yes just because you're afraid. When you make a small promise, keep it. When comparison appears, return to what is under your responsibility. And every day, set aside a few minutes of silence before God, not to repeat that you are perfect, but to ask, Lord, what needs to be corrected in me? And what do I need to stop condemning in myself? Maybe that prayer will reveal something important. Because you may be asking God for a new life while continuing to attack every single day the person who will have to live it. Stoicism teaches us that we do not need to control the crowd in order to govern our conduct, that we do not need to control yesterday in order to act rightly today. That character is built through what we repeatedly choose. The Christian faith places all of this within a greater horizon. Your worth does not need to rise and fall with applause. Your past does not need to be your identity. Your discipline does not need to be a desperate attempt to prove that you deserve love. And your growth does not need to happen apart from God. Maybe loving yourself first never meant putting yourself first above God or other people. Maybe it means finally learning to care responsibly for the life, mind, character, and heart that God entrusted to you. You don't need to worship yourself. You need to stop abandoning yourself. You don't need to believe that you have no flaws. You need the courage to correct them without turning every flaw into a sentence against yourself. You don't need to wait until you become someone else before you can begin living in peace. You need to start walking today toward the person you know you should become. And now I want to leave you with one final question. Which of these 6 areas has caused you to abandon yourself the most? Approval, guilt over the past, fear of solitude, lack of boundaries, broken promises, or the inability to accept who you are today? Write it in the comments, not to expose your life, but to name the point where your change needs to begin. And if this content helped you see Stoicism and the Christian faith not merely as ideas, but as principles capable of transforming the way you live, subscribe and keep walking with us. Because inner peace is not born when the world finally decides to treat you the way you wish it would. It begins when you stop giving the world an authority that never belonged to it, and learn to live with character before yourself and with purpose before God.